In July, as the Allied breakout from Normandy accelerated, the OSS sent Hall new orders. They were parachuting in Jedburgh teams, three-man units of American, British, and French officers tasked with organizing large-scale guerrilla operations. Hall was to coordinate with them, integrating her existing networks with the arriving commandos. It should have been a relief, having professional soldiers to share the burden. But the Jedburgh officers were young, trained in conventional warfare, and some of them struggled with the idea of taking orders from a middle-aged woman who milked goats. Hall didn't argue. She simply demonstrated competence. She showed them her maps, marked with German positions, supply routes, and weak points. She introduced them to Maquis leaders who controlled hundreds of fighters. She coordinated a series of ambushes that destroyed a German supply column and captured enough weapons to arm 2 more resistance companies. The Jedburgh officers stopped questioning her after that. By August, Hall's area of operations had become a liberated zone in all but name. The Germans held the towns, but the countryside belonged to the Maquis. They controlled the roads at night. They intercepted German communications. They launched raids that grew bolder as the Wehrmacht's grip weakened. Hall coordinated it all, still moving between safe houses, still transmitting to London, still one step ahead of the Gestapo agents who were now themselves being hunted. The war was turning, and everyone could feel it. The question was no longer if France would be liberated, but when and at what cost. On a morning in early September, Hall received word that American armored columns were advancing from the south, pushing up from the Riviera landings. The Germans were withdrawing, fighting delaying actions, trying to retreat in order before the whole front collapsed. Hall's Maquis harassed them every mile, turning retreat into rout. And then, on a bright autumn afternoon, the first American tanks rolled into the villages Hall had been operating in for 6 months. The crews were young, exhausted, covered in dust. They didn't know that the old woman standing by the roadside, watching them with quiet eyes, was the reason their advance had met so little resistance. They didn't know she'd been there, in the shadows, cutting the wires and burning the bridges that might have stopped them. Hall watched them pass, and then she turned and walked back toward the farmhouse. There was still work to do. There were still Gestapo agents in hiding. Still collaborators who needed to be identified. Still weapons to be recovered and records to be compiled. The liberation was a beginning, not an end. But for Virginia Hall, the war in France was over. By October, the OSS pulled her back to London and then to Washington. They debriefed her extensively, mining her reports for intelligence on German order of battle, Gestapo methods, resistance effectiveness. They praised her work. They called her one of the most effective agents the OSS had fielded in Europe. And then, quietly, they sidelined her. The war was entering its final phase, and the OSS was focused on Germany itself, on operations that required parachute insertions and frontline coordination. Hall volunteered for every mission. She was refused every time. Too well known, they said. Too much of a legend. The Gestapo still had her file, and Germany was a harder target than occupied France, she argued. She insisted she could be useful. But the men making the decisions saw a woman in her late 30s with a prosthetic leg, and they saw risk, not capability. So Hall spent the final months of the war behind a desk in Washington, writing reports and training new agents, while the organization she'd helped build went to war without her. When victory came in May 1945, Virginia Hall received the Distinguished Service Cross, the only civilian woman awarded the decoration during World War II. President Truman wanted to present it in a public ceremony, to celebrate her heroism, to tell her story to a nation hungry for heroes. Hall refused. She didn't want publicity. She didn't want attention. The Gestapo's hunt for the Limping Lady had taught her the value of invisibility, and even in peacetime, she preferred the shadows. So they gave her the medal in a quiet office. No photographers, no press, just a brief handshake and a citation that detailed almost nothing of what she'd actually done. The specifics were still classified. The legend remained secret. After the war, Hall tried to continue her intelligence career. The OSS was dissolved, but its successor, the CIA, was being formed, and Hall applied immediately. She was accepted, one of the first women in the agency. But the CIA of the early Cold War was an old boys' club, built by Ivy League men who saw intelligence work as a gentleman's profession. They gave Hall assignments, a posting to Venice, later to Paris, but the work was analytical, administrative, support roles. They didn't send her into the field. They didn't use the skills she'd proven in the darkness of occupied France. She was a woman, and she had a prosthetic leg, and the men running the agency couldn't see past either. Hall endured it for years, filing reports, watching younger, less experienced men get promotions and postings she was denied. She never complained publicly, but those who knew her saw the frustration, the waste of a mind and a will that had outmaneuvered the Gestapo and organized guerrilla armies. She retired from the CIA in 1966, at the mandatory retirement age, after a career that never matched the heights of those months in occupied France. She moved to a farmhouse in Maryland with her husband, Paul Guillot, a former OSS officer she'd married after the war. They kept goats, an echo of her cover in the Haute-Loire. She gardened, she read. She rarely spoke about the war, even to friends. When historians or journalists tracked her down, asking for interviews, she politely declined. The work, she said, was classified. The people she'd worked with deserved their privacy. And the legend, the Limping Lady who terrified the Gestapo, wasn't someone she wanted to revisit. That had been another life, another woman, forged in necessity and danger and a world that no longer existed. Virginia Hall died in 1982 at the age of 76. Her obituaries were brief, noting her OSS service and her medal, but little else. The full scope of her operations remained classified for years afterward. It wasn't until the 1990s, when documents were finally declassified, that historians began to piece together the full picture. The networks she'd built, the operations she'd coordinated, the lives she'd saved, and the Germans she'd killed. They found the Gestapo file, the one Klaus Barbie had kept, the one that called her the most dangerous Allied spy in France. They found the radio transcripts, the mission reports, the after-action summaries written by Jedburgh officers who'd served under her direction. And they found a legacy that the CIA had never properly honored, a career that should have been celebrated but was instead buried under classification stamps and institutional sexism. Today, there are biographies and documentaries, museum exhibits, and academic studies. The CIA finally honored her properly in 2016, posthumously awarding her a place in their exhibit of trailblazing female officers. The U.S. Navy commissioned a ship in her name. Her story is taught in intelligence training courses as a masterclass in agent tradecraft and resistance organization. The Limping Lady is no longer a secret, but the woman herself, the one who limped through Lyon, who climbed the Pyrenees with a wooden leg, who milked goats while coordinating sabotage operations, who spent her final years in quiet obscurity, remains somehow elusive. A ghost behind the legend, perhaps that's fitting. Virginia Hall spent her entire intelligence career being underestimated, by the State Department that rejected her, by the Gestapo that hunted her without ever understanding who they were hunting, by the CIA that couldn't see past her gender and her disability to the brilliance beneath. She turned those underestimations into weapons. She used invisibility as armor, and in doing so, she became exactly what the Special Operations Executive had needed her to be: ungentlemanly, relentless, and utterly effective. The Third Reich called her the most dangerous Allied spy in France. They were right, but they never caught her. Not in Lyon when the net was closing. Not in the Haute-Loire when she was hiding in plain sight. Not ever. Because Virginia Hall understood something that her enemies, and later her own government, consistently failed to grasp. The most dangerous person in any room isn't always the loudest, the strongest, or the most obvious. Sometimes it's the one no one is looking at, the one who limps, the one they've already dismissed, the one who smiles quietly and starts planning 3 moves ahead. That was her victory. Not the medal, not the legend, but the fact that she walked into the fire again and again and walked out when everyone said she couldn't. The Pyrenees should have killed her. The Gestapo should have caught her. The war should have broken her. And after the war, obscurity should have erased her. But Virginia Hall, the woman they called the Limping Lady, refused to be erased. And in the end, history had to catch up. The escape over the Pyrenees should have been impossible. It was late autumn, and the high passes were already snowbound. The journey required 3 days of hard climbing, scrambling over rocks and ice, with guides who knew the smuggler trails and the patrol schedules of the Spanish Guardia Civil. For a trained mountaineer, it was brutal. For someone with a prosthetic leg, it was suicidal. Cuthbert wasn't designed for alpine terrain. The wooden limb had no flex, no give. Every step on uneven ground sent jolts of pain through the stump. The harness rubbed her skin into open sores. But Hall didn't complain. She told her guide she'd be fine. She radioed London before the climb. "Cuthbert is being tiresome." The radio operator, not knowing Cuthbert was her leg, replied, "If Cuthbert is being tiresome, have him eliminated." She smiled at that. Then she started climbing. 3 days and 2 frozen nights later, Virginia Hall crossed into Spain. She was exhausted, frostbitten, and bleeding beneath the straps of her prosthetic. But she was alive. The Spanish authorities arrested her immediately. Spain was officially neutral, but it leaned toward the Axis, and refugees from France were routinely imprisoned. Hall spent weeks in a detention camp before the British embassy secured her release. By early 1943, she was back in London, and the SOE wanted to send her straight back into France. But her face was known now. The Gestapo had distributed her description across occupied territory. The Limping Lady couldn't limp back into Lyon, so Virginia Hall did what any good spy would do. She changed. She dyed her hair gray. She learned to walk differently, adopting a shuffling peasant gait that disguised Cuthbert's rhythm. She studied dental techniques to change the shape of her jaw. She became old, invisible, beneath notice. And she switched agencies. The SOE was British, and she was American. The United States had finally created its own intelligence service, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. Virginia Hall joined them. And in March 1944, 3 months before D-Day, she returned to France. Not as Germaine. Not as the Limping Lady. This time she came as an elderly peasant woman, a nobody, a shadow. And the Gestapo, still hunting the legend of the well-dressed American with the limp, never saw her coming. But that story, her second mission, the sabotage campaign she waged in the lead-up to the Normandy invasion, the Jedburgh team she coordinated, the SS columns she helped destroy, that belonged to the next chapter of a war that wasn't finished with Virginia Hall yet. On that November night in 1942, as she limped through the snow toward the Spanish border, she didn't know she'd return. She only knew that somewhere behind her, in the files of the Gestapo, her legend was growing. And legends, she'd learned, were both a weapon and a curse. The snow that nearly killed her in the Pyrenees melted by spring. By March 1944, Virginia Hall was back in France and the Gestapo didn't recognize her. They were still looking for the elegant American correspondent with the limp, the woman in tailored jackets who moved through Lyon's cafes with quiet confidence. They weren't looking for the hunched peasant woman in a worn wool skirt who shuffled through the villages of central France, her gray hair tucked beneath a threadbare scarf, her face lined with theatrical age. Hall had become invisible in the most dangerous way, not by hiding, but by transforming into someone beneath suspicion. She was 58 years old according to her forged papers. She was a widow. She milked goats. She made cheese. And in the stone farmhouse where she worked, in the Haute-Loire region near the village of Condalier, she operated a radio that spoke directly to London and coordinated the resistance operations that would cripple German defenses before the Allied invasion. The OSS had given her a new code name, Diane. Her mission was different this time, more focused, more lethal. The SOE had used her to build networks, to organize, to create infrastructure. The OSS wanted her to destroy. Specifically, they wanted her to prepare the resistance in central France to become a guerrilla army, one that could cut German supply lines and communication routes the moment the Allies landed in Normandy. The logic was brutal and sound. Every rail line blown in the Massif Central, every telephone cable severed, every Wehrmacht convoy ambushed, meant fewer reinforcements reaching the beaches where young men would be dying in the surf. Hall's work wouldn't be visible on D-Day. It wouldn't make the newsreels, but it would save lives hundreds of miles away, in ways no one would ever quantify. She landed by British motor torpedo boat on a moonless night in Brittany, transferred to a safe house, then took a series of trains south, changing identities twice, until she reached the farmhouse that would serve as her base. The area was ideal for resistance work, rugged, forested, with valleys that could hide men and caves that could store weapons. It was also crawling with German patrols, Vichy militiamen, and informants who sold names for cash or extra ration cards. Hall couldn't afford to be the limping lady here, so she became something else entirely. She dressed in layers of ragged clothing that made her shapeless. She rubbed dirt into her skin. She adopted the slow, arthritic gait of age, using a walking stick not to hide Cuthbert's limp, but to transform it into the shuffle of an old woman whose bones ached. And it worked. German soldiers passed her on roads without a glance. Militiamen checked her papers and waved her through. She was a grandmother. She was no one. But at night, when the farmhouse shutters were closed and the oil lamps dimmed, Diane became someone the Third Reich should have feared more than any battalion. She assembled her radio, extended the aerial wire through the window into the branches of an apple tree, and transmitted encoded messages to London. She requested weapons drops, containers of Sten guns, ammunition, plastic explosives, detonators. She coordinated reception committees, groups of resistors who lit signal fires in remote fields and hauled the heavy containers into hiding before dawn. She recruited. Not the young firebrands eager for glory, though there were some of those. She wanted farmers who knew the land, railway workers who understood German schedules, telephone engineers who could sabotage a junction and make it look like weather damage. She built her network carefully, using cutouts and compartmentalization, so that no single arrest could unravel the whole. The men who joined her called themselves the Maquis, the scrubland, the wilderness, a word that meant both the rough country where they hid and the wildness of their resistance. They were young, mostly, boys who'd refused the German forced labor draft and fled to the hills. They had courage and anger, but they didn't have training. They didn't know how to set an ambush without getting themselves killed. They didn't know how to use the weapons London was sending. So Hall taught them. In clearings deep in the forest, she showed them how to strip and reassemble a Sten gun, how to wire a plastic charge to a rail line with a pressure fuse, how to withdraw from contact without leaving a trail. She was twice the age of most of them, and she was a woman, and she had one leg. But when she spoke, they listened, because Diane knew more about killing Germans than any of them, and she proved it. By May 1944, Hall was coordinating multiple Maquis groups across 3 departments. She identified targets, railway bridges, telecommunications hubs, roads the Wehrmacht would need for moving armor north toward Normandy. She passed targeting information to London, and the RAF sent bombers to finish what sabotage couldn't. She organized supply networks to feed and arm the growing resistance forces. And she kept moving, never staying in one place longer than a few nights, always aware that the Gestapo's hunt for the limping lady hadn't ended. They just didn't know she was already among them. An old woman who smelled of goat cheese and wood smoke. Then came June 6, 1944. D-Day. The news crackled through hidden radios across France. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The invasion had begun, and across the French countryside the resistance erupted. Hall's Maquis groups struck their assigned targets within hours. Railway lines were blown in a dozen places, cutting the tracks that led north. Telephone cables were severed, plunging German command posts into communication blackness. Convoys were ambushed on narrow forest roads, trucks burning, Wehrmacht soldiers pinned down by men who vanished into the trees before reinforcements arrived. The Germans called it terrorism. The Allies called it irregular warfare. Virginia Hall called it arithmetic. Every bridge down meant a delay. Every delay meant time. And time, in those first critical days after D-Day, was measured in lives saved on distant beaches she would never see. The reprisals were immediate and savage. The Wehrmacht and the SS knew they were being bled by the resistance, and they responded with the only language they trusted: terror. Villages suspected of harboring Maquis were burned. Hostages were shot in town squares, their bodies left hanging as warnings. The Gestapo intensified their sweeps, rounding up anyone whose papers seemed wrong, whose story had inconsistencies, whose face didn't match the fear they expected to see. Hall moved constantly, staying ahead of the dragnets using the network of safe houses she'd established. Twice she was stopped at checkpoints. Twice the German soldiers glanced at her stooped posture, her weathered face, her identity card that said she was a farm wife named Marcel Montaigne, and let her pass. The disguise held, but it was fragile, and Hall knew that luck was a resource that depleted with use. Lyon, France, November 1942. The safe house door stood half open, and that was wrong. Virginia Hall knew it the moment she turned onto the cobblestone street, her wooden leg clicking against the stone in a rhythm she'd learned to disguise with careful, deliberate steps. The door was always closed, always locked. The woman who lived there, a baker's widow who smuggled radio crystals in flour sacks, would never leave it ajar, not even for a moment. Hall stopped beneath the shadow of a tobacco shop awning, her breath steady, her mind already 3 moves ahead. She didn't run. Running would draw eyes, and in Vichy France, eyes meant death. Instead, she turned, slowly, as if she'd forgotten something, and began walking in the opposite direction. Somewhere behind her, in that narrow apartment with the crooked shutters, the Gestapo were waiting. They'd been hunting her for 16 months. They didn't know her name yet. They didn't know her face, but they knew her legend. They called her the Limping Lady. And across occupied France that name had become a whisper that chilled even the SS. She was the woman they couldn't catch, the spy they couldn't see. And tonight, she just walked past her own trap. The Gestapo had a file on her. Dossier number 4.328. It sat in a gray cabinet in the Lyon headquarters, growing thicker each month, filled with reports that contradicted each other, sketches that looked nothing alike, and a single constant: a limp. Every informant mentioned it. Every failed raid uncovered another piece of her network, but never her. The officer in charge of her case, Klaus Barbie, a man who would later earn the title the Butcher of Lyon, had written in the margin of one report, "She is the most dangerous of all Allied spies. We must find her." But how do you find a ghost? How do you catch someone who moved through occupied territory like smoke, who organized sabotage cells and escape lines and arms drops, all while walking on a wooden leg that should have made her the easiest target in France? Virginia Hall wasn't supposed to be a spy. She wasn't supposed to be in France. She wasn't even supposed to be alive. The daughter of a wealthy Baltimore family, she'd spent her youth learning languages: French, German, Italian, dreaming of a career in the Foreign Service. She was brilliant, ambitious, educated at Radcliffe and Barnard, fluent in the diplomatic niceties that opened embassy doors. But the U.S. State Department had rules. Old rules. Unforgiving rules. And when Virginia Hall applied in 1931, they saw a woman first and everything else second. She was refused. Not for lack of skill. Not for lack of intelligence. For lack of a Y chromosome. So she went to Europe anyway, taking clerical positions in embassies across the continent, still hoping that competence would eventually override prejudice. Then came December 1933. A hunting trip in Turkey. A cold morning in the Anatolian hills. Hall was climbing a fence, shotgun in hand, when the weapon discharged. The blast tore through her left foot. Gangrene set in during the long journey to a hospital in Istanbul. The surgeons had no choice. They amputated below the knee. She was 27 years old, and the life she'd imagined, the diplomatic career, the legitimacy, the respect, was severed along with the limb. The State Department's rejection, when it came, was polite and final. A person with a disability, they explained, could not serve in the Foreign Service. She named her prosthetic leg Cuthbert. It was heavy, wooden, and unforgiving. It chafed her skin raw during long days. It made every step a calculated effort. But she learned to walk with it, then to hike with it, then to dance with it, because Virginia Hall refused to be an object of pity. When war came to Europe in 1939, Hall was in Paris, working for the French ambulance service. She drove supply trucks through blackout nights, evacuated wounded soldiers as the Blitzkrieg rolled west, and watched the Third Republic collapse under the weight of panzers and Stukas. She was in the flood of refugees heading south when France surrendered in June 1940. But while millions fled toward safety, Hall turned around. She went to London, and in London she found the one organization that didn't care about her leg, her gender, or the State Department's narrow imagination. The Special Operations Executive, Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, cared only about results. They were recruiting agents to parachute into occupied Europe, to sabotage, to kill, to organize resistance. They needed people who could blend in, who spoke flawless French, who understood that survival in Nazi territory required more than courage. It required cold, relentless intelligence. Hall volunteered immediately. The SOE trainers watched her carefully during the covert operations course in Scotland. They taught her how to kill a man silently, how to pick locks, how to recognize Gestapo surveillance patterns, how to encode messages using one-time pads and transmit them on suitcase radios under the noses of direction-finding trucks. They taught her that a spy's greatest weapon wasn't a gun. It was the ability to become invisible in plain sight. And they saw quickly that Virginia Hall had something most recruits lacked. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She looked at a problem, an extraction, a sabotage target, a blown cover, and solved it with the same calm precision she'd once used to draft diplomatic cables. Her instructors gave her high marks. They also gave her a code name. She would enter France as Germaine, an American journalist reporting for the New York Post. The cover was plausible. The Vichy government still maintained a pretense of neutrality with the United States. An American with press credentials could move, ask questions, make contacts. And Virginia Hall intended to do all three. She arrived in Vichy, France in August 1941, one of the first female SOE agents deployed into occupied territory. The country was split. The northern zone, including Paris, was under direct German military occupation. The southern zone was governed by the Vichy regime, collaborators who governed from the spa town of Vichy, enforcing Nazi racial laws and arresting resistors with eager efficiency. It was a country of checkpoints and curfews, of informants and secret police, where a misplaced word or a suspicious glance could end in a cellar interrogation room. Hall established herself in Lyon, the largest city in the Vichy zone, a warren of traboules, hidden passageways threading through buildings, where resistance could breathe, barely. She rented an apartment. She filed occasional stories about rationing and daily life under Vichy rule. And she began to build a network. The work was slow, methodical, invisible. She made contact with existing resistance cells, fragmented, distrustful groups who'd lost members to Vichy police sweeps and Gestapo torture. She identified safe houses. She recruited couriers, most of them women, because the Nazis rarely suspected women of serious espionage. She arranged weapons drops, coordinating with RAF bombers that flew low over the French countryside at night, releasing containers of Sten guns, plastic explosives, ammunition. She organized escape lines for downed Allied airmen, creating a hidden railway of farms and convents that smuggled pilots out of France and into neutral Spain. Every operation required planning, patience, and an acute awareness that one mistake, one informant, one followed courier, one intercepted message would collapse the entire structure and put a noose around her neck. The Gestapo began noticing patterns. Arms caches discovered by the resistance, sabotaged rail lines, British agents moving through Lyon with new identities and forged papers. Someone was coordinating it. Someone with skill and resources. They started asking questions. Informants reported a woman, well-dressed American accent, who met with known resistors in cafes. She walked with a limp. Always the limp. The reports piled up. The legend grew. The Limping Lady. The Gestapo wanted her badly. But Hall was always a step ahead, changing safe houses, altering her routines, using the traboules to vanish into Lyon's stone veins whenever surveillance grew too close. Then, in November 1942, everything changed. The Allies invaded North Africa. Hitler, in response, ordered the Wehrmacht to occupy the Vichy Zone. The pretense of French sovereignty evaporated overnight. German troops poured south. The Gestapo came with them, and Klaus Barbie set up his headquarters in Lyon. The city became a hunting ground. Resistance members were dragged from their beds. Torture chambers in the Hotel Terminus ran day and night. The network's hall had spent 16 months building were being torn apart, one arrest at a time. She knew the net was closing. The Gestapo had her description now, sketchy but specific. A woman, American, a limp. They were checking hotels, boarding houses, interrogating concierges. She had to leave Lyon, she had to leave France. But the borders were sealed, the coasts watched, and the Pyrenees, the only route to neutral Spain, were buried under winter snow. That night in November, when Hall walked past the open door, she didn't panic. Panic killed spies. She walked calmly to a backup safe house, a narrow room above a butcher's shop where the smell of blood and sawdust covered all other scents. She burned her papers. She encoded a final message to London, tapped it out on her suitcase radio while listening for the whine of Gestapo direction-finding equipment, and signed off. Then she packed a small bag. One change of clothes, forged identity papers, a compass, and a map of the Pyrenees. She left Germaine behind. The journalist cover was blown. Now she was just Virginia, an American woman with one good leg and a 100-mile mountain range between her and freedom.